My name is Vasilis Strogilos. I'm an associate professor at Southampton Education School at the University of Southampton. I'm a teacher by training, and before joining Southampton, I held academic positions in higher education in Singapore and Greece. My research focuses on how we can make schools more inclusive for students with special educational needs and disabilities. With regard to particular projects I've been engaged the recent years, I've done several studies on how we can include students with disabilities in mainstream schools through co-teaching, differentiated instruction, and more recently, how we can develop resource provision as an inclusive service. Resource provision is the use of staff with training in special educational needs and disabilities, or the use of separate rooms within mainstream schools to support students with disabilities in mainstream settings. In this project, I worked with teachers, teaching assistants, parents, and children with disabilities themselves to explore how resource provision functions within mainstream schools, and also to identify the benefits and barriers when we educate students both in resource provision and mainstream classrooms. We found that resource provision can operate in two different ways, either as an inclusive service or a safe space, though many schools use a mix of both. In the inclusive service model, the students with disabilities are primarily educated in mainstream classrooms with supports provided from the resource provision staff, whereas in the safe space model, the students spend most of their time in the resource provision and a few hours per week in the mainstream classes. We argue that the inclusive service model should be prioritized because it better supports the academic and social inclusion of students with disabilities, something that it also aligns with the Department for Education's current policy on inclusion. Saying that, flexibility is also very important because there are students whom we don't yet know how to educate fully in the mainstream classrooms. We also identified 8 key areas that schools need to focus on to educate students with disabilities through their resource provision. And this included how the resource provision can support the whole school, the education of students with disabilities in the whole school, how resource provision staff and mainstream teachers plan to transfer students from the resource provision classrooms to the mainstream classrooms, how we educate students with disabilities in the mainstream classrooms through appropriate adaptations and modifications of the curriculum, what type of individual teaching or small group support we provide to these students in the resource provision classroom. Other important areas of support are how we enhance students' friendship within the mainstream school, and how we work with parents, with external professionals such as speech and language therapists, and the vital role of the local authority in providing ongoing support. Using these 8 areas, we co-designed a resource provision toolkit with teachers, teaching assistants, parents, and students in 3 schools in Hampshire. The toolkit is an open, free resource for schools to use. It includes guidance, examples of good practice, case studies, and schools can use it to make their practice and policy more inclusive for students with disabilities, as well as they can use it to evaluate their own practice. After sharing the toolkit on social media, we received very positive feedback. It sparked a wave of interest from schools, special educational needs advisors. Some local authorities have also distributed it to their schools with resource provision. I've been also invited by national organizations to give talks and to write articles in forums and websites that parents, teachers, and policymakers read. And since then, it gained the attention from the Department for Education. Over the past 2 years, I've increasingly engaged with policymakers at the Department for Education. I was first invited to provide oral evidence for the Delivering Better Value in SEND program, then for the Curriculum and Assessment Independent Review. I also took part at a roundtable organized by the Department for Education, which focused on how we can make mainstream schools more inclusive for students with disabilities. And most recently, I was invited to present my research findings on resource provision to DFE policymakers and analysts. Overall, my experience was very positive. It encouraged me to think more deeply about the practical and policy implications of my research, to see my findings not just from an academic lens, but also from a policy-making perspective. It was also challenging. I often had to respond at a very short notice. I needed to communicate the findings and recommendations clearly and persuasively, showing the positive impact on schools, families, and children with disabilities. I also had to consider which aspects of my research could realistically be translated into policy, especially given the government's current fiscal constraints. I hope to see the widespread use of the resource provision toolkit. I encourage schools to use it as a practical tool to reflect on how they can make the resource provision more inclusive. The impact should really go beyond increasing the number of students with disabilities in mainstream settings. It should be about removing the barriers to learning and participation, both in education and later in society.